As Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney arrives in Beijing for an official visit to China, Canada's leader seeks to forge new partnerships around the world to transform the Canadian economy from one that has been too reliant on a single trade partner. At a time of global trade disruption, Canada is focused, according to its leader, on building a more competitive and sustainable as well as independent economy. Carney said in his statement before arriving in Beijing. He added that the visit to China is an effort to re-energize a dormant strategic partnership, while noting that U.S. intervention in Venezuela is far-reaching. For its part, China's calling on Canada to take a more independent foreign policy toward strategic autonomy. Carney is set to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping and other officials on Friday. So what are the achievable expectations from the visit by the Canadian Prime Minister to China? How big of a chance to reset the relationship? And how can China-Canada better work together towards far more equitable global governance? To answer all of these complicated questions, let's be joined by our panelists. For more on China-Canada relations, we are joined by four panelists. In Shanghai, Shending Li, former executive dean of the Institute of International Studies and former director of the Center for American Studies with Fudan University. In Vancouver, Canada, Jia Wang, senior fellow with the China Institute from the University of Alberta. Also in Ottawa, Canada, we have Ian Lee, associate professor from the Stroud School of Business at Carleton University. Last but not least, in Waterloo, Canada, Paul Sampson, president for the Center for International Governance Innovation. Welcome to all of you. Well, we should say at this moment, the mood is to celebrate at least the moment, which is the very first time in 8 years, Prime Minister of Canada visiting China. Now, to you, Mr. Sampson, what do you think is the significance of this, given the international backdrop and the bilateral relations?
Yeah, so almost a decade since Canadian and Chinese leaders have talked about, serious way forward in bilateral relations. So it'll be a reset of bilateral relations. I think they're going to develop a strategic framework going forward here with some pragmatic first steps. The context right now of international turbulence and uncertainty, I think this is a good sign. Canada and China both need each other.
I heard a lot of key words: reset, pragmatic, and strategic. So what about to you, Professor Shen? What are the key words that you have in mind at this moment, the very early stage of this visit?
This trip means China, Canada, as the two great powers in the world, need to work together to defeat this kind of isolationism and unilateralism. One major power in North America and other major power on the global stage have a great responsibility to help reshape the normal track of globalization.
All right. Mr. Lee, it seems that what Professor Shen is trying to say, does Canada have the gut to be able to be independent in a way in both its foreign policy and also in its trade policy and relations?
This is, I believe, the most important meeting in my lifetime between the leader of China and the leader of Canada, because the momentous occasion of this year, 2026. Canada is at the precipice. Canada is facing an existential crisis in its relationship between the United States on the one hand, China on the other. And of course, they're not only the two largest and most powerful countries in the world, they're Canada's number one and number two trade partner. So this is not just an idle conversation. And so there is enormous pressure, I believe, on Prime Minister Carney to get it right, to reset the relationship, which went badly off the rails over the last 8 years, as Paul mentioned. And so that's why this trip is so important. It has such strategic consequences.
Ms. Wang, what can be achieved?
As our Prime Minister is trying to engage directly, face-to-face in China with Chinese leadership, and really to further that relationship at the highest leadership levels. The Chinese leaders seen Prime Minister Carney as someone who has a vast experience in business, in economics, but also a highly internationally minded leader on the global stage. So there is a sense of that already mutual respect being built. I think this trip will further build that respect. And in addition to, of course, meeting with Chinese leaders, Prime Minister Carney will also meet leaders of business in China, industries. So there's really a very strong focus on improving relationship, especially in the economic realm of this relationship.
Right. Mr. Sampson, it is no secret that within Canada, no consensus yet has been strongly reached as to how to deal with China, how to deal with the United States. A lot of fluid situations as we speak. But looking at the issue of Venezuela, Greenland, the latest Monroe or Donroe approach, and also the governance styles of your neighbor. Mr. Sampson, how prepared Canada need to be? Meanwhile, while being prepared, how Canada is going to show its sincerity to whoever it wants to work with, including China?
Yeah, Canada got a wake-up call from President Trump saying, this relationship is not what you thought it was. But at the same time, Canada is not in the position to just trust, words, right? So Canada wants to see real commitment from China to open, sustained trade, and not regular tit for tat back and forth. It happens on both sides of the border, but I think Canada wants to see China as a reliable partner here, not at the expense of the United States relationship. When you poll Canadians, they say, yeah, we want better relations with China and we want better trade with China, but not at the expense of the United States relationship. So Canada doesn't see this as zero sum. We think we can do a win-win. It's a fine line. I totally agree. But I think the two economies are complementarily, structurally. They complement each other. Natural resources, energy, finished products. There's an easy win-win space there for Canada and China. We have some irritants as well that I think the strategic dialogue can start solving as well.
All right. We have seen phenomenons for this administration in your country, Mr. Sampson, that have to deal with the legacy, if I could use a very diplomatic word, of the last administration when it comes to trade. For example, 100% tariff on China's EVs, and also heavy tariff on steel and aluminum. So when Ottawa expects China's sincerity, what about sincerity coming from Ottawa? Especially recent weeks, we've seen some tariffs in some new categories. One could argue it's for negotiation's sake. We understand that, but still, would this administration have the capacity and the gut and the resolve to walk back some of the earlier policy that might not be necessarily healthy for this relationship?
Yeah, thank you. I think this government, the Carney government, has the guts and the desire to do what's in Canada's interest. I think they will be willing to roll back tariffs. Right now, we've got tariffs imposed on Canadian goods from the United States on Canadian goods, and we have them imposed by China. So we're getting it from both sides, right? And so Canada's got to find a way to negotiate with both simultaneously here, right? In that they're linked. Talked about how China's Canada's second largest trading partner, but the largest trading partner is almost 10 times that size, right? So we cannot separate out the two because the U.S. relationship is so fundamental. We're going to diversify more away from the U.S. economy is certainly the plan, but it's such a big relationship right now that that's going to remain very, very large under any scenario that I can think of.
Are you suggesting the negotiations with Washington and with Beijing on trade, economic issues will be done separately, or will be done also interactively, which I think makes the situation very interesting and certainly a lot of fun, to say the least. Mr. Sampson.
It would be quite the it would be quite the three-party negotiation, wouldn't it? So I don't think they're going to take place exactly simultaneously, but my point is they're very much linked, right? Like if you look at the auto sector, what Canada does around the future of autos in general, beyond even electric vehicles and more specific products, there are big questions about the future of that sector, right? So we have to link both sides of the equation here in determining the best path forward for Canada. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Right. Recently, we see what the Europeans describe as soft landing when it comes to negotiations with China on electronic vehicles. Mr. Di, I want to call on your expertise here. When you see the vehicle and the car making industry, it's big for every country. The interesting thing going on between the two neighbors in North America, Canada and the United States, is the Washington administration today is saying, we don't need any of those from you anymore. They almost make a statement like that. Well, at the same time, Canada knows it is important to have new energy development, clean energy, as well as electronic vehicles. But how much do you think the EV example between EU and China would be of interest to Canada when it comes to negotiation, the way of doing it and the way of interacting even with Washington after that?
This is why I think that the negotiations that are going to happen over the next 3 or 4 days or discussions are going to be tempered or constrained by the relationship of the United States. I mean, Prime Minister Carney is going to be very conscious of the fact that he can't go too far. He doesn't have many degrees of freedom in discussions with the People's Republic of China, the government of China, because of Mr. Trump in Washington, and the CUSMA negotiations are starting imminently. And we don't know the outcome. I mean, Mr. Trump said only hours ago that he doesn't even think the U.S. needs a CUSMA treaty with Canada. What that means, I think, and we don't yet know whether we're going to even have an auto industry. I've argued in a paper I've written that if we cannot export to a large market like the U.S., Europe, or China, we do not have the size, the scale, the economies of scale to make cars. So if Trump is really sincere and saying, you're not going to export cars anymore to the US without tariffs, then I argue that we are going to be out of the car business. Well, that will give more degrees of freedom to Prime Minister Carney in his negotiations with the Chinese government on reducing the tariffs on Chinese EVs. Right. On the other hand, if he throws a bone to Canada and says, well, you can export your cars, but we're going to put restrictions on it to prevent you from reducing your tariffs on the Chinese EVs, then we're really going to be in a quandary. So it really depends on how the relationship unfolds on CUSMA before he can go too far with negotiations or commitments to the Chinese government.
Right. Professor Shen, we have seen great interactions between the leaders of both countries on the sidelines of APEC last year, which led to where we are today. And this Prime Minister experienced in businesses and also in international circumstances. So Professor Shen, what kind of mentality is China having right now in dealing with this trip?
I would propose to Mr. Carney and my leader that let's smile, shake hand, drinking and whining, and find how we can use a better approach, which would truly show our spirit of globalization.
We have a year 2025, a tariff war year of one country against the rest of the world. That trade ties could help nations to build trust at all? After all, that was your earlier agreement, isn't it, Mr. Sampson?
Yeah, I think it is a tough period right now for really all countries, right? There's tariffs bouncing around everywhere. I don't see those tariffs going to zero in a hurry. Even if the U.S. administration changes, with a different, completely different style, I think they'll be tempted to keep some tariffs, things seem to stick around for a while, right? They have political support. So we're going to be in a tariff world. I don't think it means that we can't have deals. I like the idea of being creative. Often the way out on a sticky trade agreement is through a quota agreement, right? It is true that China is producing huge numbers of EVs, and that's a challenge for markets. So can there be quotas that are determined that allow some market access without flooding, too much too quickly? And just one other thing I would say is that we talk about Canada being small. It is small in comparison to the United States and in China, but it's not that small. We're still a top 10 economy in the world. We're actually larger than the Russian economy. I don't hear many people calling Russia small, right? So Canada is actually a very lucrative economy and a lucrative market for China. I would reject the idea. I'm not saying anyone's suggesting it on this call, but that somehow Canada is irrelevant. I just don't buy it.
We talk about trade, the trade in the easy part. What about trade in the difficult part? Whether it's chips, rare earth, and the list goes on, it seems, as a result of development of AI. So we have seen, Mr. Li, over the past few days, G7 economies coming together with some of their other counterparts suggesting they're going to reduce the so-called reliance on China for rare earth. Of course, earlier, as a result of negotiations with the United States, China exercised the choking point after the U.S. choked China on chips and many other things. So that managed to have the two countries come together for a negotiation and somewhat have a period result. How long that will last, we don't know. But Mr. Li, how do you see the latest attitudes coming from the statement making by these economies, including Canada on rare earth, and how much will that, in a way, tell us more about Canada's thoughts about what is the relationship with the United States, what is its relationship with its other trading partners like China?
I want to quote someone who's very well known to China, and that's the late, brilliant geopolitical thinker, Henry Kissinger, who, of course, convinced Richard Nixon to develop a relationship with China. Kissinger famously said, nations do not have any friends, they have interests. And he said the role of leadership of any country is to determine your country's interests and the countries you are dealing with to try to create, I'll use my own words, a Venn diagram of where there's overlapping interests. And so I think that we can come to an agreement with the United States if we don't try to compete with the United States head to head on, for example, automobiles. We're not going to. We're far too small, even though we're very large and important. I agree with Paul, but we're 1/12 the size of the United States. And so the United States, though, needs some of our resources. So does Europe. And of course, China does. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're going to, and I think Prime Minister Carney understands this, we are going to have a big debate in Canada because there's a lot of opposition to the development of oil and critical minerals and natural gas. But I don't think we have a choice. To be very blunt, I do not believe Canada has a choice. The idea that we can compete head to head with and take on China or the United States is preposterous. And so we need to find commonality and common interests between Canada and China on the one hand, between the United States and Canada on the other. And if he can thread the needle and find that narrow Venn diagram of overlapping interests, I think he can do a deal with both the United States and with China.
Mr. Sampson?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there are win-win options here for China and Canada. I agree. I think we have to acknowledge that there's some issues that are going to take longer to resolve and be patient, right? Look for some quick wins. Acknowledge that there's some irritants continuing over time about, diaspora in Canada, political interference, and these kinds of issues that need to be discussed, but in the context of a strategic, positive relationship.
Not just the Canadian leadership, it's the whole country. Canadians are very much on board in looking at Canada's options. How can we build resilience in our economy? How can we reduce the oversized dependence on our American as a partner, and how can we actually grow our trade relationship with other countries, and Canada and China being part of that kind of grand rethink and a part of that Canadian strategy. So Canada is reaching out to, of course, in addition to China, and to hoping to strengthen relationship with traditional allies like EU countries, but also to many other Asian countries like India and other ASEAN countries. So it's part of that Canadian rethink about not just how to defend and advance our current economy, but also into the future.
When we talk about strategic issues, there are other strategic issues and bottom lines for China. For example, the Taiwan question. We understand as we speak, there are parliamentarians of Canada that are visiting Taiwan, even though some of the Liberal parties parliamentarians already returned home. There are still some there on the island. Now, as you know, Mr. Sampson, China look at Taiwan, part of China. China and the mainland and Taiwan belong to the same China, and it is China's red line. And one could also say there would be tremendous danger if that red line is not being respected. So, Mr. Sampson, how is Canada, within your own debate, looking at the different parts of this relationship with China and think seriously how they should be linked and interact with one another?
Yeah, I think Canada needs to be aware of sensitivities and political realities, right? And so I think finding the fine line between longstanding friendships and relationships with Taiwan and sensitivities that Beijing would have about that, Canada needs to walk that fine line. It needs to be aware of it, right? And I agree that kind of, just individuals kind of just doing what they want. This should be something that Canada thinks through very carefully about how we manage that. And in other areas as well, again, we need those multilateral rules around what is it that applies, and that applies globally, and we respect those rules, all of us.
Professor Shen, what do you think on the issue of Taiwan, for example, on the question of Taiwan, as the translation should go?
I think Canada and China should be sensitive to each other's sensitivity. Let me strike a bit hard. If Canada care China's respect of Canada's claim that Quebec is an inalienable part of Canada, Canada may need to pay similar respect to China. And Taiwan is too distant to Canada, so don't play fight.
We talk about trade, we talk about political relationship, territorial integrity, things like that. But one thing we shouldn't ignore, that is the people-to-people relationship. Whether it's education, academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, to understand each other's culture better.
Well, you're asking somebody who has a strong interest in this. I've been in the classroom for 38 years. From the time I started teaching in the late 80s, I would say 20% of my students were Chinese Canadian or Chinese foreign students on a student visa. 1/5 of my students, until about 5 or 6 years ago, when the relationship became extremely frosty and difficult between China and Canada. And now the number of Chinese students I have in my class is probably only 2%. And I think that both sides are losing from that decline, that precipitous decline in students. I thought that, and I did believe deeply in student exchanges. I've been teaching in Shanghai since 2002 for 20 odd years. But having students going back and forth between the two countries, I think, is beneficial to both countries, because it raises levels of understanding and cross-cultural understanding and all that stuff we talk about. But it's very, very real. And I think it's very significant and it's very important. And I hope that that's one of the things that Prime Minister Carney is going to discuss in the next 3 days, is how can we reinvigorate exchanges between Canadian students going to China and Chinese students coming to Canada.
Right.
I think it'll be benefit both sides.
For a long time, when we talk about Canada, we automatically would have a feel of warmth. I was a PhD student of Professor Xi Jinping, who used to be Fudan University president. He told us the best Chinese cuisine is not in China, not in Hong Kong, but in Vancouver. I have many friends in Canada, American friends living in Canada, and Chinese and Canadian diplomats and academics. But now I feel a mixed feel. Canada is still my loved country, but I have some suppressed feel. I only feel such a feel would be resolved. After a few years, especially after Mr. Carney's visit to China, we would more or less return to the oldie goldie days. More Chinese would be happy to go to Canada for their overseas study. And Fudan University would welcome lots of Canadian studies and your faculty to teach at Fudan to educate our young souls.
I see all of you are having the guts because for people-to-people exchanges, because we, even though are celebrating this bilateral interaction this time with Prime Minister Carney's visit to China, nobody knows yet the result of it. And all of you are having the guts to come out and talk on the record about your expectations and pragmatism in this relationship. So shall I congratulate you before we wrap up? So thank you so much, Professor Shen, Ms. Wang, Mr. Li, and Mr. Sampson. Appreciate it.